Politicians are generally desperately self-loathing, insecure people that can't live without the validation of holding office. It fills a hole in their psyche that can't be met any other way.
That is Bradley Tusk. He managed campaigns and directed communications for some of the biggest names in politics. Chuck Schumer, Mike Bloomberg, Andrew Yang. He went on to earn his chops in tech as Uber's first political advisor and is the guy credited with keeping the company from being killed by regulators. So whenever you catch a ride, think of Bradley, because it paid off big for him too.
Travis calling to tell me what the new valuation was going to be and then therefore what my shares were worth. That kind of money just had never even crossed my mind. And I'm like, holy shit.
He went on to be a famed political advisor to FanDuel, Lemonade, Tesla, and other startups, but remains a man doing everything at once. Incubating startups, working on mobile voting and hunger. He owns a bookstore, has a podcast, a column in Fast Company, and is an adjunct professor at Columbia Business School. He's also the author of 2 books, The Fixer, My Adventures in Saving Startups from Death, and a new novel called Obvious in Hindsight coming out this November. Most notably though, he runs a venture capital fund called Tusk Ventures and a political consultancy called Tusk Strategies, both of which operate under the same thesis.
Every policy output is a result of a political input.
We spoke about everything from startups, politics, regulation, getting rich using ketamine, and a whole lot more. Stay tuned.
Just to get into, have you done ketamine therapy?
No. This is the Lavoisier Podcast. Welcome to the new narrative.
All right, so first one for me, I kind of just want to start as macro as we can here.
Yeah.
What do most people get wrong about politics?
The fundamental motivation of all of it, right? So every policy output is a result of a political input. I can't say that often enough. Politicians are generally desperately self-loathing, insecure people that can't live without the validation of holding office. It fills a hole in their psyche that can't be met any other way, which means it doesn't matter what the substance of something is, doesn't matter what's right and wrong, what's good for their constituents, their district, the country, the world as a whole. It solely matters how is it going to impact the next election. And because of gerrymandering, the vast, vast majority of elections in this country are really decided in the primary, not in the general election. Primary turnout is typically 10 to 15%. And so when you want to understand why politicians do what they do, they're only thinking about that 10 to 15%, because at the end of the day, if you're in a gerrymandered district and the people who do vote in your primary are happy, you can't lose, right? In which case, that's your only goal, is to stay in office. And so I think people often think that at the end of the day, oh, they'll do this because it's the right thing to do. And if that were true, schools and churches wouldn't keep getting shot up, and yet that happens endlessly.
Gotcha. That in mind, saying all policy outputs are the result of political inputs, do you think there's a situation where you can incentivize, the quote unquote right people to get into politics in the first place?
So I had a meeting the other day with a group that, I forget their name, but something about electing 50 people under the age of 50 to the House, whatever it was. And I was a little tough on them. And I just said, listen, I believe that you will find talented people who care and mean well and all of that. What I have yet to see many people come into the system and then not be changed almost immediately by it, right? So I think you can elect good people, but I think that no one puts up with all of the shit that comes with running for office unless you really need it psychologically, unless you really have that kind of deep insecurity, because it's just otherwise, it's humiliating to constantly ask people for money and support and votes and all of that stuff. Once in a while, there's a rock star like Obama and it's all roses and whatever, but that's not the average campaign. The average campaign's fucking awful. And so given that, I think that once you go through all of that, you're not going to easily give that up just to do the right thing. And so you may be a little smarter than the average politician. You may be a little better educated. You may have a little bit of better motives. But I've yet to see that. There are exceptions for sure. But overall, I've yet to see that many of them come into the system and then come out the same way.
Right. So even if you come in with good intentions or whatever, you think it's sort of either you play the game or you don't make it.
You have to be, look, the one politician that I worked for that was different was Mike Bloomberg. I was his campaign manager, ran for mayor, and I worked for him at City Hall. And the reason why Mike, I think in some ways was such a successful mayor is he really did govern as if he was only going to serve one term. Now, again, it's easier to do that when you walk into the job with billions of dollars in the bank, right? So like Mike was, his ability to procure things to feel better about himself in some way wasn't dependent solely on being a state rep or a city councilman or a member of the House or whatever it is. So he had different inputs to begin with, but he's the only one that I've seen that said, you know what, fuck it. I'm just going to govern solely based on what I think makes sense. I'm not going to worry all about the political ramifications, and we'll figure it out. And we did, but we had unlimited money to spend on the campaign, so that made it a lot easier, right? So, and also the job of mayor lent itself well to that mentality because people really just want a city that is clean and safe and well run. That's all they're really looking for. And if you can provide that, they're going to reelect you. And if you can't, they're not. So Mike, by being an engineer and so operationally minded, just from his own personality, it just fit it very well. If you're a legislator, it's very hard for people to have any sense of what you're really doing because it's so intangible and you're one of a big body of people and you're probably not the person making the decisions. And but generally speaking, the point here really should be for the listeners and for the viewers, if you want a politician to do something that you think is important, you can achieve that. My entire career is based around that thesis. But you have to make them think that what you want will either help them win their next election or by not doing it, it could cost them their next election. If they truly believe that you could impact their ability to stay in office, they'll work with you, right? But those are the terms you have to put it in. Otherwise, it's like you're speaking, one language to them and they are speaking German to politicians and they only speak English and they know what the fuck you're saying. So
inputs and outputs.
Yeah, exactly.
You think this has always been the case, right? I'm not much of a historian myself.
I'm not, but I would say yes. So I think in the sense that I think human nature is human nature, right? And my guess is if you go back to the Greek Senate and the Roman Senate and all of this stuff, they were probably the same way. And they weren't quite as accountable, so maybe different behavior. But overall, there are always people who just have this insatiable, desperate need for validation, and public office is a way to fill it. So, yeah, I think that's the way it is. I think that we now live in a world, though, that when you combine human nature with social media, with Fox News and MSNBC, with a post-Citizens United world and everything else, everything becomes so hyper-polarized and so partisan and so negative that it feels like this is the worst it's ever been. I don't know if that's actually different, but it certainly feels that way.
Would you run for office?
No. I get this question decent amount, as you can imagine. The only job that I would ever want to have elected would be mayor of New York, in part because it's not really a legislative job. It is an operational job. And, when I ran the state of Illinois for 4 years, I was the deputy governor and oversaw the state's budget, operations, legislation, policy, and communication. So I believe I can do the job reasonably well. But I think I would be a terrible candidate for office. And B, if you just look at the trend lately in really big cities in this country, so New York, Chicago, LA, Houston, Boston, that are majority minority, I think people are just sick of having white guys being their mayor. There's no reason Brandon Johnson should have won over Paul Vallis in Chicago, in April, but he did, I think in large part simply because in the primary, you had multiple black candidates and they split the vote. And then once you got to the runoff, it was a black candidate, a white candidate. And I think people of color just said, you know what, we're tired of these fucking white guys. And but I don't blame them, right? There are some that are really good mayors. Mike Bloomberg was a white guy who was a great mayor, but Bill de Blasio was a white guy who was a terrible mayor, right? So not only do I think that my personality isn't suited well for it, I think the demographic trends don't really help me either.
Gotcha. You spoke a little bit about Mike Bloomberg earlier. Let's leave him out of the equation. Do you have a favorite politician? Yeah.
So I'll answer that in two different ways. So the first is my brother-in-law, who I genuinely both love and like, is a member of the House. His name is Josh Gottheimer. He's a cool congressman. And Josh is truly, impressive. He is the creator of something called the Problem Solvers Caucus, which is one of the only bipartisan groups in Congress that actually can get people from the other side to vote for a bill that the other party cares about. And so he's been able to bring Republicans on for bills like infrastructure and the CHIPS Act. And Josh is from a suburban district of New Jersey. And look, because he is in one of the few remaining swing districts, his general election matters more than his primary. So he doesn't win re-election by catering solely to the primary voters. In fact, a lot of the far left voters in the district really don't like him at all. But he's able to have kind of a moderate pro-jobs, but also, pro just general human, rights and all that, that it works really well for his district. So Josh is, sticking to Jersey, Phil Murphy, the governor, someone that I really admire and like quite a bit. And there are a bunch. Look, I think Eric Adams is an interesting mayor. There's a lot about Eric I like. There are things that I don't like. The problem isn't so much the individual. Kind of gets to the question you asked earlier about what if we just elect better people? There are a lot of really good, smart people who are in these jobs, but how often are they willing to do something that will clearly hurt or cost them their ability to stay in the job just because it's the right thing to do? That number gets a lot smaller very quickly.
Gotcha. I've got to ask, you're a remarkably sort of reasonable guy. I think when it comes to politics, you're not necessarily afraid of singing the praises of someone, even if they're on one side of the aisle or the other. How do you distill your own political philosophy personally?
Yeah. So the first is, I think that we're getting into it, right? Which is, I have a piece on Medium called The 10 Rules That Demystify Politics. And to the extent that you're finding this podcast interesting, look it up. But, I've got a lot of vehicles now by which I try to sort of convey this approach. And that is through, I teach at Columbia. I host my own podcast called Firewall. I write columns for Fast Company for the New York Daily News. I wrote a book a couple of years ago. We'll talk about it. I've got a novel coming out in November, but they all effectively say the same thing, which is every policy output is the result of political input. So part of it is trying to get that point across. Part of it is, I take the issues that I care about and actually try to do stuff about them, right? So Tusk Philanthropies, which is my foundation, and it's completely self-funded. We do a couple of things. So the first thing is mobile voting. So if you believe that every policy output is a result of political input, if you want different outputs, you need different inputs. So I kind of figured this out a little bit when I was working for Uber. I'm the guy, like it or not, that ran all the campaigns to legalize ride sharing and Uber all over the US. And the way that we won, because at the time we were a tiny little tech startup and taxi was a pretty muscular industry, is we were able to mobilize ultimately millions of customers through the app to tell their elected officials, leave this thing alone. I don't want to lose it. It's useful to me. And we changed the inputs, right? All of a sudden, you're a city councilman in Tulsa and the taxi guys give you $3,000 per election cycle. All things being equal, you do what they want in return for the $3,000. I said 3,000 of your constituents call, email, text, tweet, tell you to leave this thing alone. The inputs just shifted wildly. You don't have 3,000 votes in your primary, right? So now all of a sudden, I'm not touching this thing, which is how we won in every single market in the country. And so having spent sort of the first 15 years of my career in city, state, and federal government, and then doing all the stuff with Uber, that kind of said, okay, one, policy outputs are shaped by political inputs. Two, you can change the inputs. Three, the people who you want to be able to mobilize are not so apathetic that they won't do anything. It's that they won't not take their kid to school on a random Tuesday so they could vote in a city council primary, state senate primary, whatever it is. So if you make it easy enough, they very well might participate. And guess what? We all have a supercomputer sitting in our pockets. That's a far more reliable way to do things than filling out a paper ballot or using a voting machine. And so we started the mobile voting projects in 2018. We have funded elections in 7 states, 21 jurisdictions where either deployed military or people with disabilities have voted in real elections on their phones. Turnout on average has more than doubled, and all of them were audited by the National Cybersecurity Center and came back clean. We started getting lots and lots of shit from the cybersecurity community that it wasn't safe. So I put $10 million of my own money into a tech bill to build our own mobile voting technology. The reason I had $10 million, because I didn't grow up with it and I worked in government, is when I worked for Uber, I took my fee in equity, and that worked out pretty well. And then since started venture capital fund and a bunch of other stuff that makes money. But we are about 5-6 of the way done building the tech, I would say. We did some beta testing right now, and penetration testing is next. And we're going to make it open source and free for anyone who wants to use it. And my hope is that, we can eventually build a movement that will force the status quo here to accept that people should be able to vote on their phones. It'll be a far and away the safest voting system ever built, end-to-end verified, end-to-end encrypted. And so that's number one. Number two is hunger. So we fund and run campaigns to mandate programs like universal school meals, breakfast after the bell, expand the SNAP for seniors. The thesis we had was a lot of these hunger bills in states weren't particularly controversial, but they weren't passing because the hunger community lacked the political sophistication and resources to run real campaigns. And so our question was, well, what if we did that, right? So what if my people ran these campaigns and I'm personally the client? So the lobbyists, the PR firms, the polling, the digital, whatever it is, it's all coming out of my pocket. Seems to work. So we've passed bills in 20 states so far. About 12 million more people now have access to food on a regular basis. About $5 million of my money has unlocked about $1.5 billion a year of new government spending, or helped unlock it. Other people certainly involved too in hunger programs. We are right in the middle of a bunch of legislative sessions right now. We passed universal school meals in Vermont, anticipating a veto by the governor that we will override. We were able to get funding in New York for another 300,000 kids every single day to get breakfast and lunch. We are in the middle of fights in North Carolina and Connecticut, and I suspect we're going to lose in Oklahoma. But nonetheless, again, changing the inputs, right? So it went from an issue where it just didn't get a lot of noise, and the people making the noise were just these sort of do-gooders who no one cares about anyway. When I wasn't getting what I wanted at Albany, I started running mobile billboard trucks, paid for out of my own pocket, saying, Speaker Hasty or Senate Majority Leader Cousins or Governor Hochul, why are you letting kids starve? And they freaked the fuck out, right? Because they're right there in front of the door. They walk out. They're being accused of letting, they're progressive Democrats, letting kids starve. And I made it pretty clear, like, guys, just give us the money. And then you didn't let kids starve. Now you're a hero. And eventually they did. And I switched to thank you ads instead. So that's number two. The third is teleabortion. So my fund invests heavily in digital health. And there will be a day where people will probably do surgery in the metaverse. But right now, basically, digital health is a medical provider and a patient are communicating over some sort of electronic device, and then some sort of prescription is generally dispensed in some way, right? It's pretty simple. And when Amy Coney Barrett got confirmed at the Supreme Court, and it was clear that the votes to overturn Roe were there, I started thinking about it and thinking, like, how is what, like Roman, which is one of our portfolio companies that sells Viagra and Ozempic and other drugs like that, how is that really different than if someone wanted to use abortion medication to have an abortion? And the answer is, it's not. And so the question was, well, if women in South Carolina, in Tennessee, in Arkansas, can go online, talk to a doctor, and have the med sent to them, how is the state going to stop that? The answer is they can't, right? And so we created, along with some other people, this thing called Mayday Health, which is an education nonprofit that shows women in red states how to forward, set up P.O. boxes to forward their mail, so it can be sent legally from the doctor in, say, New Jersey to a P.O. box in Michigan to then your home in Utah, wherever it is. We connect abortion providers with patients, and then we run legislation. In fact, the New York State Senate will pass our bill today on protecting doctors who do this from any sort of legal liability, so that they give them as much comfort as they can in doing this. And so those are the three things we got in my foundation. Point being, when you ask political philosophy, part of it is trying to convey this thing that most people either don't believe or don't want to say out loud. I was on Squawk Box the other day and I said a lot of this stuff out loud and people were just fucking shocked. They liked it, but they were shocked. And part of it is putting my time, my money where my mouth is, right? There are lots of people out there who don't like me, a lot on the far left, a lot on the far right, because I don't support their points of view. I will say this, if you like me or don't like me, I put my money where my mouth is.
So, I mean, all of this being said, the political inputs, policy outputs, working with people on either side of the aisle, what is the political input for a new party, for instance? I know you've worked with Andrew Yang a lot.
Yeah, I've been talking to Andrew about this. The input exists in the sense that people are certainly frustrated with the system, right? Congress has like a lower approval rating than used car salesmen and ambulance chasers and things like that. But at the same time, a third party, because I looked at this quite a bit when for my Bloomberg over the years. Could we run Mike as an independent for president? The challenge was he didn't really fit into either party. With enough money, you can get someone on the ballot, right? So I had to figure out how we could get Mike Bloomberg on the ballot. And by the way, mainly some organization on my and the team's part, but mainly his money, right? Which I had nothing to do with helping him earn. So The challenge is permanent ballot lines for everything, for city council, for dog catcher, for mayor, for governor. And the states make it so hard for any third party to consistently qualify for a ballot line that these parties are always, because you have, like, we should take New York as an example, we have the Independence Party, we have the Conservative Party, there are Working Families Party, there are other parties, and they're always fighting for their survival. So look, Andrew is working on something called the Forward Party. It would be a third party. I have spent some time on it. I love Andrew, support what they're doing. It is really hard. I wonder at the same time if trying to cleave the existing parties might not accomplish the same goal in a more realistic way. It's always easier in politics to kill things than it is to create things. Maybe that's just true in life in general. And you have two parties with these existential divides, right? You have Democrats who are, lean a little more towards a social safety net than not, but at the end of the day are not socialists, right? They believe in private property. They don't believe in, they believe in business. And then you have Democrats who don't, right? Who genuinely believe that the state should own and run all assets and there should not be a police force and things like that. It would be great if we were two different parties, because right now, your average Democrat, even if they're not radically far left, and most of them are not, if the only people vote in their primaries are the people who are radically far left, they have no choice but to become that, or at least espouse views and take votes that support that, because they want to get reelected, right? And so in order to satisfy the base and stay in office, they do things that they don't actually want to have to do. Same thing is true on the Republican Party, right? There was at least this sort of Mitt Romney-esque kind of pro-business Republican Party that wasn't just about sort of, socially conservative positions at all times at the expense of absolutely everything else. But again, your average Republican doesn't vote in the primaries. And so as a result, the people who do, you're hardcore Trumpers. The reason why Trump didn't ultimately get impeached in the Senate was not because January 6th didn't happen, not because Mitch McConnell, Lindsey Graham, and all of them weren't literally running for their lives, but because they were afraid of a primary in their next election from a Trump supporter, right? So if you could somehow create enough division to cleave them, where all of a sudden there was a new party, Trump, Libertarian, whatever you conservative want to call it, DSA, Sanders, AOC, whatever you want to call it, then all of a sudden the real benefit is all those nuts are now voting in their own primary as opposed to the traditional Democratic primary, traditional Republican primary. And that then frees up the Democrat, the Republican to work together, right? So like I mentioned my brother-in-law before, he gets protests in front of his home all the time from the far left. And do you know what they're upset? That he dares to talk to Republicans, that he dares to work with Republicans. How dare you even, fraternize with the enemy, right? And Josh, to his credit, has the balls to sort of do what he wants to do anyway. But Josh is also a really talented guy who, if he wasn't in office, could go make a lot of money very quickly in lots of different ways. And so I think he has a little bit more confidence to say, okay, if this does, I'm going to do what I want to do. And if it doesn't work, I've got plenty of other things I can do. But that's a very rare perspective for someone to have. And so I think you have Republicans, Democrats that would generally like to work together. I mean, you're going to see on this debt ceiling bill right now. But they don't have the freedom to do so because they're so terrified of their primaries. So if you had 4 parties instead of 2, it would achieve that goal. Or if the Forward Party were really successful, it could help achieve that goal. And look, I think we should be doing all of this, right? So even though I personally believe that mobile voting is the only scalable solution to fixing democracy, I still support, open primaries and Final Five and ranked choice voting and the Forward Party, all this other stuff too. It's all really good. My main gripe with all the other reforms is that they're beneficial, but they're incremental because it still requires someone to go to the polling place, right?
Gotcha.
And for as long as you have to do that, just turnout's going to be, just extremely limited.
Gotcha. So it's all in the name of accessibility.
Yeah. And think about voter suppression, right? And, the reason why these new laws in Texas or Georgia are designed to try to make people have to come and wait in line and then potentially turn them away if you don't think they're going to vote for your candidate. Look, the very first thing I ever did for Uber was I wrote an ad for Black Radio saying, when you call for an Uber, no one knows the color of your finger, because every African-American I've ever met can tell the story of seeing an empty cab, having their hand up and being passed right by. And the Black community ended up being a huge base of support for us throughout the entire campaign over a period of years. Same thing with voting, right? if you're just voting from home, no one knows what color your finger is, right? And so the suppressing it will be a lot harder. So yeah, I mean, I think it has, not only I think it has the potential to sort of fix democracy. If we don't do this, I'm not sure why it will still be one country in 20, 25 years, because you get to a point where you can't get anything done. Everything is a crisis. Everyone hates each other. You know, you're going to start seeing president after president sort of now being impeached and indicted and all kinds of stuff like this. And the logical answer might be, you know what? We're better off being like the EU. Let's split up into a bunch of countries. We'll have common treaties, common currency, shared infrastructure, but we'll make our own laws, right? And that, absent something that can enable politicians to move to the middle and work together and get stuff done, that's where we're going to end up.
Gotcha. I think that was probably a good opportunity to sort of move from politics into some more of the regulation stuff, because it's interesting because you've sort of spent most of your career between the political and sort of tech realms. I'm curious to start on regulation. What's your take on big tech antitrust? Like, who's most susceptible? Who's most deserving?
Yeah, so it's funny. We're Lena Khan, who is the chair of the FTC, is coming here to P&T Knitwear. I'm going to interview her about all of these topics specifically. And I think the reason why I've built a little bit of a relationship with them is I seem to be one of the few venture capitalists who will publicly support breaking up Facebook and Amazon and Apple and all of these companies. And the reason I do so is not even really from a consumer standpoint. It's from the perspective of, as an early stage investor, so my venture capital fund invests in seed and Series A companies in regulated industries. I have to see the potential for the company to ultimately succeed, to go public, to be a purchase, and ultimately generate enough returns to return the fund. And if you are a potential competitor of one of those companies, I can't invest in you because they have such oligarchic, monopolistic power that there's so many different ways that they can crush you that I just have, or buy you way under market value because you don't have a choice, that I can't make any money on it, right? So as a result, all of the potential upstart competitors to Microsoft, Google, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, whatever it is, are not getting funded simply because those companies have so much power that it makes the investment worth, just a bad idea. And that's going to kill innovation, right? Just like the people at those companies 10, 20, 25, 30 years ago had incredible ideas that they were able to use to challenge the existing status quo and move things ahead and forward. That has to keep happening, right? And sure, there's innovation happening at those companies too, but it shouldn't just be exclusive to them because everything and everyone grows stagnant eventually, right? There was a day where if you said IBM or General Motors or General Electric, like these companies will dominate the world forever. Like they're like afterthoughts now, right? And so point being, for the economy to work, for innovation to succeed, there has to be constant disruption. And I think that if you can't fund the companies that will cause the disruption, you can't have that. And the reason you can't have that is because the companies are allowed to get away with too much. And so I think what the FTC is doing is absolutely right in trying to break up a lot of these big tech companies. And I think you've also seen, by the way, a rare display of bipartisanship in Congress, where you've seen bills actually move from both sides of the aisle that give the FTC more resources, more jurisdiction to pursue these cases, simply because I think that, look, whether you're a Republican, Democrat, primary, not primary, whatever it is, we all use Apple. We all use Amazon. We all use Meta. We all use these products. And A, we all feel like we're probably getting ripped off. B, for those of us who are parents, we're fucking terrified because we have no real ability to control what our kids are seeing and doing online. And C, because there's no privacy framework in this country at all, we're just totally at the mercy of these companies that are, look, they're not inherently good or evil. They're companies, right? The point of a company, I still think, and I'm a University of Chicago guy, so I'm a little biased on this, but it is to maximize profit for shareholders. Milton Friedman was absolutely right about this. And they are fulfilling, it's a lot like our point discussion earlier about politicians, right? The input for a company ultimately is what's going to affect earnings. And then the output is the share price, right? And that's ultimately what's going to determine their actions, not anything altruistic, not anything about the good of society overall. They might occasionally, either for some bullshit ESG reason or as a PR campaign, they might embrace something. But overall, they're about, price per share. And so if you don't force change on them, it's never going to happen. And then you're ultimately going to end up strangling your own economy.
So let's say inside or outside the sort of scope of what you're talking about with antitrust, hopefully outside the scope of any of the sort of initiatives you've been talking about earlier. Let's say Bradley Tusk is president of the United States or king, right? What's the first executive order? What would you be changing?
Well, so at least just sticking on this topic.
Sure.
I would revoke something called Section 230. Do you know what that is?
No.
So Section 230 is a provision that was in the Telecommunications Decency Act of 1996. But what it says is actually very important, which is if I defame you on Twitter, on Discord, on YouTube, whatever it is, you can sue me, but you can't sue the platform. And the problem is, as a result, the companies have perverse economic incentives. So we know that just because of human nature, negative content drives more clicks and more eyeballs than positive content. Toxicity sells. As much as we hate that that's true, it just does. And you just get more traffic. And if you were any of these platforms, again, if your only goal is maximizing revenue to maximize your earnings, you're going to do whatever you need to do to drive eyeballs to the site. And if negative content will get that faster than positive content, you're incentivized to do so, which is why we don't really have any real content moderation online. But if that legal protection went away and all of a sudden, like Instagram, for example, they have groups that teach teenage girls how to cut themselves, how to purge after they eat, like truly horrific things. But you know what? They make Instagram money, and that makes Meta money, and that makes their shareholders money. So if you revoke Section 230, which, by the way, both parties, no one's watching, so nothing gets done, but both Trump and Biden called for it in 2020 in their platforms. So if you were to revoke Section 230 and the liability changes, then the economic incentives for these companies change, the inputs change. That leads to a ton of class action lawsuits, not like what we saw with tobacco in the 1980s. And that leads to a series of jurisprudence that says, here's what, where the companies do have responsibility and here's where they don't. And I think as a result, we'd see a lot more reasonable content moderation. And by the way, as AI comes, this could require the platforms to be able to accurately label something as AI or real. And right now, if they do it or don't do it, they've no skin off their back. If they're legally liable for getting it wrong, they're going to be a lot more careful.
I understand what you're saying on sort of the economic incentive side, the moderation side. Do you think something like Twitter or Instagram would survive if, they were able to, they had to take on so many lawsuits?
I think, look, they may not, right? But again, if we were to also do antitrust, and I'm not, Instagram is owned by Meta, right? If we're investing in competitors all the time because now, they don't have the power to just squash every form of competition, they may not survive, but then someone else will come along that's better and do it instead, right? By the way, Twitter may not survive anyway, right? It's not doing all that great. Nor do I think that these platforms, look, as someone who works in politics, I think Twitter has been an incredibly destructive force. As the parent of teenagers, I think Instagram has been an incredibly destructive force. So I would not shed a tear if either of those companies went out of business.
Fair enough. I think this is getting toward sort of a bigger point across what we were talking about earlier in terms of political polarization, in terms of what we're talking about in social media platforms. There's sort of this larger erosion of trust in institutions that seems to, I think, have come up, at least in my own lifetime, my own experience over the last 20 years or so. Sure. I've really noticed it. What do you think are driving factors there? And what
I think this is a trend that actually not only predates you, but even predates me, which I think this began during the Vietnam War. So if you look at data from Pew and others about trust in government, the military, the church, higher ed, Wall Street, academia, all of our institutions, they've all plummeted over the past 60 years or so, I would say. I think it's because the wars that the U.S. had been in up until then were perceived as just, right? World War I, World War II were things where we chose to get involved to save the world. We didn't necessarily have to. I'm glad we did, especially as a Jew, but nonetheless. And for the first time, Vietnam was widely perceived as an illegitimate war being taken on for the wrong reasons and killing millions and millions of American soldiers, right? Like it was serious consequences. I think that's when people started losing trust. You saw the upheaval of the 60s, which was very good. It generated a lot more rights for a lot more people. But obviously, in order to change the system, you have to sort of break the faith in the system in the first place. And I think the civil rights movement did a really good job of doing that, and that was necessary. And then you had Nixon and Watergate and OPEC. And then all of a sudden now we're into a world with cable TV and then streaming and internet, and now we're going to Web3. And so negative information is so widely conveyed that, the ability to, institutions tend to do better in terms of their approval ratings if they can control all of the mechanism of communication, right? The reason why China has severe limits on lots of different social media apps is because that government would be a lot less powerful and a lot less popular if people could speak freely about their discontent. If they're literally prohibited from doing so and face real risk if they do so, it changes behavior. Now, it's an autocratic, terrible way to live. But I think the democratization of technology and media combined with some really bad decisions by government like Vietnam and Watergate, I think all together, also combined, I think to a certain extent with wealth inequality, where, you have a world now where there's always been wealthier people and less wealthy people, but the separation between the 1% and everyone else is so significant now that I think that breeds quite a bit of resentment as well. And so if the people who are running the institutions are seen as sort of, the fat cats who are profiting, that also generates more hostility. So you put that all together, and I think you're right. It's been the last 20 years. I think it's really even been the past 60 years or so. And look, until we can reestablish some of that trust, it's going to be really hard to get anything done. That's part of, again, why mobile voting to me makes so much sense, which is if you can change the inputs and give politicians enough political cover to work with each other to compromise and get things done, that does start to reestablish trust, right? But right now, basically most of the time, we're passing every bill on a partisan basis, pretty much, occasionally, like I mentioned on the CHIPS bill, the infrastructure bill, there's a handful of Republican votes that come in or Democrats on the other side of it. But, if you start seeing the two parties working together and compromising and getting things done on serious issues like climate change or guns or immigration or whatever it is, that starts to rebuild faith in the system.
Gotcha. Let's talk about startups. Let's talk about the venture stuff. And I guess in the same way we did with politics, let's just sort of talk about the broader thesis here. What's sort of the investment thesis that you guys have?
Yeah, like every early stage venture fund that we're looking at, the TAM, the founder, the idea, the underlying tech, all the usual stuff that everyone's looking at. But then we ask two more questions. One, is there a gating regulatory issue or opportunity that if it were solved can really drive growth and valuation? And if so, two, can we solve it? And when the answer is yes to both, that's really what makes sense for us to deploy capital. So we invested in FanDuel and all the campaigns to legalize daily fantasy sports betting. We invested in Lemonade, got them their insurance licenses. Invested in Roman, helped legalize digital prescription. Invested in Bird, legalized electric scooters, and so on. And so we're specifically looking at companies who are regulated, preferably by local or state government as opposed to federal government, and I can explain why. But where we believe that if you were able to sort of solve a problem coming at them, you can materially unlock the company itself and make it a lot more profitable, make it grow a lot faster. And that's when it makes sense for us to invest. So we're now investing out of our third fund because we're not actually in a raise at the moment. I can actually talk about performance. So we're sitting at around a 4x on funds 1 and 2. Look, I have a monopoly in my tiny little niche of venture capital. We are the only fund that does this. Our fund sizes are small. Fund 3 is the biggest fund we ever did at 140 million. So our total AUM is still under 300 million. So it's very much a niche area of venture capital, but within it, we're one of one. And so we do pretty well.
Gotcha. Let's take the other side of this, right? I mean, you're someone who gets a really great top-down view on the regulatory environment, on the startup environment. Let's say request for startup, or if you had to start something yourself, what would you be doing?
Yeah, I mean, look, we're, constantly, doing that in one form or another. So I have a company right now that I'm incubating, not out of the fund because it's not really quite as regulatory in nature, but it is a website where people can debate topics like sports. AI judges the winner, and then you get a prize if you win. And then eventually we think that people can bet on themselves and then eventually start betting on third parties. So basically we're taking, what do people love about sports? They like to watch it, they like to argue about it, they like to gamble on it, right? We're saying there is no place where you can both argue about it and gamble on it simultaneously. And so it's called Runner Up Media, runnerupmedia.com is the site. We just a few days ago started beta testing where the public can log on and submit their responses and win, a $25 prize, whatever it is. Obviously, we're doing very low numbers right now. But, my thesis is that A lot of the things that we were able to make legal by legalizing FanDuel in terms of defining what is and what is not a game of skill ended up applying to this as well. And another company that we were helping incubate built software that lets you sort of create tournaments and take bets on them really quickly. So we already had that, in-house. And so you put all that together, and here's our media. So, we'll see where it goes. But, for me, when I look at sort of starting something new, it's where is there a hole that other people are not pursuing this, not because it couldn't make money, but because they're too afraid of the regulatory risk and they're wrong. Right. Sometimes people are just not afraid. Sometimes people just don't judge it accurately. But there are those holes in the marketplace, and that's what we look for.
Gotcha. We've talked a little bit about sort of the regulatory side of things that you guys specialize in. I'm curious on sort of the macro side. I know venture capital, especially in the early stages that you guys invest, you can sort of be a little bit in the weeds and tend not to account for a lot of the macro environment. And for me, let's sort of run through things. My take right now, USM2 is at $21 trillion. Bank of England, this is a really interesting stat. Bank of England banking reserves relative to GDP are at an all-time high of 38%. This is dating back to 1701, this data goes, with the last all-time high at 18% in 1947. And it's global as well, right? Chinese money supply is at 42 trillion US dollars versus US at 21 trillion. Double the volume despite 70% of the economy size on sort of a nominal basis. Are you concerned about
I think
how much money is that?
Yeah, look, it's a really good question, right? Because it gets into the basic question of, did we handle COVID properly? Because, the reason for a lot of that additional supply is because we did literally print trillions of new dollars here in the US during COVID, and EU and England and other countries did as well. So the question is, was that the right policy decision, right? So today you look at it and say, well, we're paying the price for it because we made money so cheap that we overflooded the economy. And then when you combine that with supply chain problems and other things that then popped up, inflation skyrocketed. And right now it's very expensive for people to go to the grocery store. So right now you would say, well, we clearly put too much money in the system because we're paying the price for it. On the flip side, when if you remember back to March 2020, April 2020, it felt like the world was actually ending, right? We didn't know what COVID was. We didn't know if it would kill us or not. We were worried. We did packages outside for 3 days. The germs would wear off.
Stockpiling,
all kinds of shit like that didn't even matter. And you had massive contraction in the economy and people losing their jobs. People needed to eat, right? People needed to function. The PPP program, businesses, look, my office was physically closed for about a year and a half. We have a floor of a nice building in Manhattan. Our rent is obscenely high, but I paid my rent all the way through because the landlord didn't cause COVID, and because there was the PPP program, and that helped me, get through that without having to fire anybody and without having to, we trimmed money where we could, but we were able to keep people on their salaries and their benefits intact. And so I just, after the fact, you can look at it and say, oh, we probably would have been fine if we did less, and then we'd have less inflation right now and all of that. But, we came out of one of the worst historic periods in the world relatively unscathed, right? I don't want to diminish the number of deaths, but it could have been, if you had a equally sort of viral, transmissible disease combined with, it being much more dangerous and toxic, could have killed billions of people or hundreds of millions of people as opposed to millions of people. Now, it's still millions of people. I don't want to in any way diminish that, but compared to what it could have been. And on the economic side too, yes, eggs, milk, everything is more expensive than it should be right now. And that affects people in real ways, which is why I think the hunger stuff that we've been promoting is so important, because I think we especially just can't let people go without food. But overall, I think that the negative externalities of the COVID policy responses are relatively limited compared to what it could have been.
Do you think this only goes back to COVID? Obviously we can talk about the last 3 years.
It's a good
Some
question.
people say 2008.
Right.
This is a long time coming, isn't it?
So my son and I, my son's 14, we had a debate, I think it was this weekend, where we were talking about debt and interest pay. Oh, because the debt ceiling, right?
Yeah.
So right. And said, look, on one hand, no, continue to accrue so much debt where the interest alone sucks up so much of the annual budget is a real problem. On the other hand, let's say that you're never going to pay it back, and you're never going to pay it back. You may want to borrow as much money as you possibly can, right? So if you're paying me interest, if you're paying me 3%, if I'm paying you 3% in every, $100 that I borrow from you. So I'm paying you $3 a year, but I'm never really going to ever actually repay the principal because I don't know, you tell me when the U.S. is going to repay its principal debt. The $100, now may be a lot more valuable than the 3% over a period of years. And so, on one hand, yes, we clearly have increased spending at a rate that is totally unsustainable, unless the point is everyone's cutting out on the joke and nobody's ever going to be able to recall the debt because they can't, and people need to be able to put cash somewhere. And so as long as sort of the wheel keeps turning, it's okay. That's in some ways where the debt ceiling thing got so scary, because right now, if you're China, you're India, you're someplace you have money and you need to put it somewhere else, you tell yourself, well, the U.S. it's the United States, the most stable place in the world. It's the benchhead of capitalism, democracy, and everything else. Of course, my money is safe there. For as long as you believe that, you'll keep buying debt. As long as you keep buying debt, we can keep spending it. But if we stop paying you the interest on it, the whole fucking house falls apart, right? And so to me, that was the greatest risk of the debt ceiling not being raised. And by the way, we're talking as if it has been agreement of principle between McCarthy and Biden, but it still has to pass, right? But let's assume that it does. It's that I just don't know why other countries would continue to put their money here if it wasn't even, guaranteed that the interest would be paid.
To your point, though, does that feel sustainable, right? Is this, it feels like modern monetary theory, right? Can you just keep punching the number? On one hand, no, right? But logically. On the other hand, I don't know what really stops it or changes it, right? So as a result, in theory, it doesn't make any sense. But if the reality is, look, this is all totally arbitrary, right? Numbers are a human invention, right? Money is a human construct. It's what we say it is, right? These are not laws of nature. And so if the laws changed or sort of the norms changed to where ultimately there is no realistic expectation of debt repayment, then maybe the amount of money we borrow and spend is totally irrational. Fair enough. Let's talk about Uber.
Okay.
I feel like this is a good changing point. Walk me through, I think this would be interesting. Walk me through this story. Where were you when you got the call? So how did this all happen?
Sure. So it's 2000. So worked in government, as I said before, up until Mike Bloomberg's campaign in 2009. We win, Mike gets reelected. I decide I want to start my first company. So consulting firm that runs big campaigns. So you're Walmart, you want to open up stores in 4 major downtowns. You've got zoning issues, union issues, community issues, whatever it is. We fix all that stuff for you, right? So I'm sitting in a meeting in I started the first company, Tusk Strategies, still exists, in January 1, 2010. Now it's, January, February 2011, I think it's February. A friend of mine called and said, hey, there's a guy with a small transportation startup. He's having some regulatory problems. Would you mind talking to him? I become Uber's first political advisor that day. I get really lucky when Travis calls back, Travis Kalanick, who's the founder and CEO of Uber, saying, hey, I can't afford your fee. Would you take equity? I didn't know what equity meant, but for some fucking reason, I said yes. That was back during the Series A. And then, spent the better part of the next few years running campaigns all over the U.S. to legalize ride sharing. It worked. And then along with it working, the value of the company kept going up, and obviously the value of my shares kept going up. And I'm like, oh, I remember literally there was a moment where you remember sometimes we get on the phone, I was on the couch in the den looking up at the bookshelf, Travis calling to tell me what the new valuation was going to be, and then therefore what my shares were worth. I think it was like $12 million. It had never occurred to me that I would ever have that much money, right? I didn't even dream about it because, I grew up okay, certainly not poor by any means, upper middle class, but not super rich. And I worked in government. That was me. My first job at the Parks Department paid $22,000 a year, right? I graduated from University of Chicago Law School, made $36,000 a year at the Parks Department. So that kind of money just had never even crossed my mind. And I'm like, holy shit. So I met the people who were unclear, and they said, hey, we really want to get to more airports. Could you help us? And would you take equity? And this time I knew what equity meant. I said, yes. And then eventually, I met my partner, Jordan Nuff, who was running Blackstone's internal venture fund at the time. And the question we started asking ourselves was okay, if you truly understand regulation and you can do something about it, does that make you a better investor? And if so, by how much? 10%, 20%, 30%? And we didn't know the answer, but that was the thesis that led us to try to go raise our first fund. And thank God, after 2 years of hearing no, we finally were able to raise enough money to launch. And so, that Uber phone call, I can kind of directly trace not just to some of the work that I was able to do to help legalize Uber and ride sharing, but to, my 11:30, my meeting after we're done, which is to review the board deck for a portfolio company for tomorrow. Like, that's in many ways a result of that phone call.
Gotcha. Talk to me a little bit about, there's this really interesting idea I've heard you talk about. Uber could sort of kill Lyft, in your opinion, by treating drivers as employees, which feels counterintuitive, but why don't you walk us through that?
It is, but here's the thing. So right now, you have this business where the unit economics of ride sharing are still not great. And in order to generate the kind of numbers they need to show traction, both Uber and Lyft sometimes either subsidize riders, sometimes they subsidize drivers, sometimes they subsidize both, right? And when you have two companies doing that to each other, plus a little other entrants here and there, it's really hard to ever get out of that cycle, which means it's really hard to change the profitability of the product itself. Uber for years has been fighting being classified as a W-2 employer. So there's two types of employees right now. There's either 1099, which means you're an independent contractor, or there's W-2, which means you're a full-time employee. 1099 means you have the flexibility to work when you want, where you want, how you want, but you don't get benefits or things like that. Uber's business model is based on the drivers being 1099s because if they were employees, you have to provide healthcare and all kinds of other stuff. They said their costs would go up by as much as 20%. In an already not that profitable business, it would fall apart completely. True. However, one of the things that you get when you're an independent contractor is the flexibility, like I said, to work for who you want, when you want. So if you or I were Uber drivers, we would have Uber, Lyft, and any other platform conceivable, the apps up on our phone because we just want as much business as we can possibly get. We don't care who we're driving for, right? But now imagine Uber just said, okay, all of our drivers, you have to be employees. We're going to give you health care, we're going to give you a pension, whatever else. But you can't drive for anyone else because now you're an employee, you're not an independent contractor. Drivers would just make what I would argue is the most rational choice, which would be, where can I get the most business from? Well, Uber has the most market share, so therefore I will drive for Uber, right? That's just rational, logical. When they do that and they stop driving for Lyft, then all of a sudden the network effect could work in one of two ways. So the way that it built and grew was that more and more people signed up become Uber drivers, Uber customers, Lyft drivers, Lyft customers, and the more you got, them and the more demand created, the more supply it created because it created more opportunity. But that could work in reverse too, right? And so if Lyft all of a sudden lost 70% of their drivers overnight because Uber just made them all employees instead, your wait time just went from 6 minutes to 18 minutes. And then you were the customer, you're like, well, fuck this, I'm going to 18 minutes. I'll just call an Uber, right? And that cycle keeps going where more and more Lyft drivers keep dropping off the platform to drive for Uber simply because there's not enough business driving for Lyft. More and more Lyft customers drop off. And yeah, you'll have a handful of conscientious objectors that'll find something else to do. But eventually, I think Lyft would go out of business simply because I don't think that they could sustain losing that much of their driver base and still having a company. And so if you were Uber, you could theoretically put Lyft out of business and then rearrange unit economics of ride sharing to be more profitable for yourself. Now, the real hat trick, I guess, would be then to go back to 99. I don't know if that's feasible, but if I were Uber, I would consider doing that. I think that is a pretty radical strategy that's laid out. And Derek Horshaw, who was their CEO, who was, I think done a nice job, but is a very steady, stable, go along, get along kind of guy. And so something radical like this is probably not in his agenda.
Gotcha. Now that we're on the topic of Uber, I want to sort of touch on a little bit of what we were talking about earlier as far as political inputs go. Inside or outside the context of what you did at Uber, how do you rally a constituency as a political tool? Like, how do you control a narrative in that?
Yeah.
This feels a little bit more like advertising.
Right. So I have this conversation a lot with founders. I teach this stuff in my class. I wrote a book called The Fixer that focus on this quite a bit. It doesn't work for every startup, right? So, sometimes you have to have these somewhat painful conversations with founders who'll call and say, do for me what you did for Uber. You have to find a way to politely say, like, you might have a good business, but nobody cares enough that they're going to tweet, call, email, do something, even if you make it really easy, right? So like with Uber, we were able to. So one is you got to find stuff that people are passionate about. So FanDuel is a really good example. The number of people who use FanDuel or DraftKings is tiny compared to the number of people who use Uber. But when we were running all these campaigns, you'd meet with, I don't know, some Missouri state rep and say, listen, you have 3,000 FanDuel and DraftKings customers in your district. Let's be honest. How do they not know who you are? They don't even know what a state rep is, right? These are not politically engaged people, but they love this thing. And if you take it away from them, we're going to make sure every one of them knows your name and that you're the one that did this to them, and we're going to register them to vote, and we're going to drive them to the polls next time. And guess what every politician in America basically said? Forget it. I don't need that hassle. And we won. It worked for Bird. It worked for Ease, which is a cannabis delivery company. So it works sometimes, but people have to feel like losing the product would be a real reduction in their own quality of life, and therefore the value proposition is there, the cost benefit for them to choose to act through the app and take some sort of political action. So there are things people are passionate about. There are things people are not passionate about. And sometimes you don't even know until you try.
Gotcha. I mean, now that we're talking about regulated industries, I mean, there's a lot we can touch on. We've got AI, crypto, sports betting and gambling, psychedelics is something I know you guys do a lot of. What are some industries you're sort of optimistic, pessimistic about that maybe people aren't thinking a lot about right now?
Yeah. I mean, look, the first thing is, we've never been kind of green energy investors. But part of the reason why is it's been hard to see these companies succeeding without massive government subsidization. I'm not sure that it's changed, but with Congress between the Infrastructure Act and the Inflation Reduction Act putting, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars in new money into the sector, the economics change, right? All of a sudden I'd be like, well, you know what? I could both get in and out of this company before the subsidies run out. So therefore, so a sector that we didn't really look at, even though it is heavily regulated and really important, now all of a sudden is on our plate. And then there are subsets of that, like sanitation. We looked at a really early stage sanitation startup that we didn't invest in because it was just too pre-product, too pre-revenue for us. But I think they're onto something, right, in terms of the software to make sure that companies are complying with all the new laws around, recycling and carding and everything else. So so that's one area for sure. In the transportation sector, it seems to me that we're sort of at the next phase. And so I've become a bit of a flying car advocate, and that's what my novel is about. So we haven't made any flying car investments yet, but I've been eagerly taking meetings because I love the concept of it. In fintech, a little less around Web3 and crypto, and a little more for AI around not just like pure AI companies for the sake of AI, but how can AI be a tool that our existing and new portfolio companies can use to really do their work? So for example, Elaborate Health is a company that takes those totally incomprehensible lab reports that you got from your doctor and turns them into plain English with infographics and words, and explains, here's what this means. So like I said, Googling glucose 0.62, is that good or bad, right? And then not understanding the answer anyway. They put it all into context for you. They use AI to do that. That's a really good application of AI. This sports debating gambling thing, right? We're using AI to do the judging because we could never scale up by having human beings do the judging. That's an application of it. So it's looking for applications of AI that can make a company scalable and efficient and cost effective, as opposed to, in our view, AI is a new technology, in part because we're not a deep tech fund. And like the thing, look, I can probably diligence a regulatory issue as well as anybody, but I don't know how to diligence, new space exploration technology or something like that. And so AI in context of a tool to further the underlying purpose and sort of profitability of our portfolio companies.
Gotcha. Why don't we rock our way down the list here? Right? You sort of touched on AI. What's your take macro-wise on crypto right now?
Look, I think that the point we discussed earlier about the lack of trust in institutions is really what does explain crypto.
That's sort of the manifestation of it.
Yeah, and I think if you read the white paper, and it basically, that's the point it makes, and it came out of the banking, the Great Recession and the banking failure here in the U.S. and overseas. Lots of skepticism about that, and that's what led to people saying, you know what? I don't trust the Fed. I don't trust the European Central Bank. I would rather take my chances with like-minded people who I'll never even meet, but at least we both believe in this sort of, other type of currency that is not tagged to nationalistic policies and ideals. That's a real thing. So that's not going to go away. Do I think that you had people who became sort of, crypto tourists who got really excited when Bitcoin shot up and they became day traders and all that stuff? Yeah. So I don't know if the volume will reach its height again for a while, but I think in terms of people feeling unsure about the world and wanting to diversify their asset base, just like people buy gold or whatever else, that's going to continue, which means there's going to continue to be crypto trading companies, crypto hedge funds, all kinds of different things. And then, once we hit a world where the metaverse is truly here, and truly, who knows what that exactly means, but whether it's 5 years, 10 years, where even more and more of our transactions are happening solely digitally, there's no reason for a metaverse company not to take Bitcoin or Ethereum. I mean, you might not take all 1,200 tokens, however many there are at the moment, but you would take a few, right? And so I think that commerce will evolve to make crypto more mainstream. I think that the lack of trust institutions is not going anytime soon, and that preserves a real interest in crypto. So I do think that it is here to stay. I think that in the wake of Sam Bankman-Fried, it's going to face a lot of regulatory challenges. And, at the end of the day, some of those will end up being necessary to create a legitimate marketplace, and some will end up being, too much and set things back, and that's the process. But, previous to sort of crypto winter and Sam Bankman-Fried, there'd been this sort of turf war in Washington between the CFTC and the SEC over who should run crypto. Crypto industry very strongly favored the CFTC. I think now that game's over, right? It's the SEC. They're in charge. They're going to put the rules together. Now we got to see what they plan to do.
I think a sort of bear case on the crypto side regulatorily that people seem to talk about a lot is that it's sort of fundamentally at odds with national sovereignty, with the US.
That's why China banned it.
No, completely.
Yeah.
Do you think we've sort of reached that point where enough people care enough about it that it's sort of going to work itself out? Or
yeah, I do. Well, I think in part because we just, at least now, still don't live in an autocratic society, right? And so China, if I were China, I would have banned crypto too, right? If your only goal is to minimize any potential threat to your power, why would you want an alternative currency that you don't control, right? That makes no sense. But the U.S., in some ways, the upside of our dysfunction and polarization and everything else, so we can't really do anything, which means that the ability to outlaw crypto, I think, is not going to happen anytime soon. And I do think that there is, even though these are people who are anti-systemic by nature, you could mobilize crypto users politically in the way that we did with Uber and FanDuel and Bird and Ease and so many others. And so I think there is real opportunity there. And so I think the combination of the ability to do that, combined with sort of the inherent sort of distrust in government, combined with sort of the inherent dysfunction of our system, means that I do think crypto survives this.
Gotcha. Next on my list here is Psychedelics. I know you have, I can do promo for you. You have a portfolio company called Mindbloom, I think.
No.
They're not a portfolio.
They're not. So what's interesting is, but I'm an advocate for them, which is I'm a customer.
Gotcha.
So I looked at them and didn't invest. Had Dylan, who's a CEO, on my podcast. I did ketamine therapy. I think it really radically had an positive impact on my life. I'm happy to talk about it. And so it's funny. It feels like they are because I talk to them and when they need advice, I kind of talk to them like I would a portfolio company. They'll call me like, what do we do about this thing? But it's just because I had such a great experience, I want to see them succeed because I think it made a really big difference. And just to get into, have you done ketamine therapy or anything like that? So ketamine therapy specifically is mainly used by the military for PTSD. And what ketamine potentially does, and people abuse it as a club drug or whatever else, and I had never tried it until I did the actual therapy part of it, but it reopens the neuroplasticity of your brain for a temporary period of time. So when you're a kid, you can absorb concepts, ideas, emotions, whatever it is, because your brain's like a sponge. And then when you get old like me, it's totally calcified. I'm like, you're motioning yourself. I'm like much older than you. I'm 49. And when you get old like me, there are times where you say, okay, I understand a concept intellectually, but I need to be able to process it, internalize it emotionally, and I've been unable to do so for whatever psychological traumas and reasons you have. In that specific situation, where I found ketamine wildly helpful was it helped align things for me, right? So I was able to kind of reopen that neuroplasticity, reattack the same issue with a lot of work, by the way. I mean, like, I think there's probably a lot of people who do ketamine therapy and they kind of show up once a week and they feel a little fucked up and whatever. But I did all of the thinking and writing and journaling before and after, and ended up after successions having a 25-page memo to myself that I wrote that really challenged my worldview on a tremendous number of things. And I read that memo 2-3 times a day, every day for 6 months, and I internalized it. And it really did change the way I feel about myself and my outlook on the world and a lot of other things. So, and I used My Bloom and was incredibly happy with their product and would definitely recommend it. So I believe deeply in it. I think people can really benefit from it. I think that if you're going to do ketamine therapy, the 2 real prerequisites: 1, understand what it is you're trying to now process emotionally that you haven't been able to do before. Because I think if I didn't go in with that, I don't think I would have come out with anything. And 2, do all the work, do all the therapy, do all the writing, do all the work, because that ultimately, I think what allowed me to fully internalize this was not just the 6 times that my brain got a little more open because of the ketamine, but then the concepts that it let me capture, and then this endless repetition by myself of just reading and rereading and rereading and rereading, to the point where about 6 months after I was done with it, I'm like, I got it. And I still do read that document probably once or twice a week, I would say. So yeah, I had a great experience with it. We have not invested in the sector at all, simply because at the moment, I just don't see anything that's going to become a billion-dollar technology-enabled company, right? So we haven't. But with that said, we're always looking at stuff.
As much as you're willing to share on the ketamine side, what were some of those bigger realizations for you? Yeah,
I mean, I think part of it was really just a sense for me that I'm a decent human being who, deserves to be treated well and does not have an endless sense of obligation to everyone that I ever meet. And I'm allowed to say no sometimes. I'm allowed to do, it basically allowed me in some ways to be more selfish, and allowed me to accept that, between the stuff that we do on voting and hunger and abortion, bookstore, whatever else, I'm a decent enough human being that it's enough. It's okay, right? And I can accept that about myself, as opposed to just constantly feel like I have to do more and more and more. And it's not that we don't do more, but I want to do it for the right reasons, not because I'm just driven by this sense that I need to be better. And so it was, and I understood that intellectually, because again, one of the things that I did after one of the sessions was I did an inventory of okay, anything that I can think of that I've ever done for the world from a structural standpoint. So those are things like voting or hunger, from an individual standpoint. So I volunteer at a soup kitchen every week, and I have for the last 30 years, from a community standpoint, like the bookstore, and then from kind of a sharing knowledge standpoint, which would be my teaching and podcasting and writing and everything like that. And every dollar I've ever given away that I could remember and everything else. And I kind of totaled it all up. And it's a nice list, And I think by realizing that and seeing it, it was really, really helpful. But the single thing that was the most helpful for me with ketamine therapy, and I did this after the first session, which is I went home and I made a list of all my good qualities, all my bad qualities. And what was different than doing this from before was, rather than saying either, how do I change these bad qualities? How do I mitigate them? Or just sort of hating myself for them? I said, you know what? They're all fine. None of these things are hurting other people, right? This is just you making life harder for yourself by being upset with yourself for being needy, insecure, stuff, whatever it is, right? All the stuff typically that people in politics tend to suffer from. And once I accepted that and sort of stopped hating myself for it, not only did I feel better, but now when I go back and look at the list, the problems are somewhat mitigated to a certain extent, right? But they became mitigated by not worrying about it as opposed to by focusing on it.
This is probably a good opportunity to talk a little bit about Bradley, right? What would you say keeps you up at night, right? If you could write one question down on your bedside table, wake up in the morning, you'd have the answer. What would that question be?
I mean, I think that there's, I tend to think about things in a pretty 50,000 foot way. And I've been able to create my job now in a world where I could sit here on your podcast, sound really fucking smart about a lot of stuff. But at the end of the day, also I'm talking to other people do the work on a day-to-day basis, right? So I tend to look at things from 50,000 feet. And so look, I really worry and wonder a lot about sort of the existential risk that we face. And it seems to me that we are in a race to save ourselves before we destroy ourselves, right? So climate's a really good example of that, right? We have done extraordinary damage to the climate. We continue to do extraordinary damage to the climate. But at the same time, we keep discovering things that are really good. I read an article this weekend about the possibility of generating, energy through humidity, right? Could you imagine if you could just draw it from the air and you didn't have to have any sort of, other energy source, what that could do? And so, look, whether it's nuclear weapons, AI, climate, homemade viruses and pandemics, whatever it is, we have the ability to destroy ourselves in so many ways. And yet we also have the ability to protect and save ourselves in so many ways. And I sometimes almost feel like the gods look down on humanity as like this Shakespearean tragedy and comedy of like, let's make them just sentient and conscious enough to feel right and wrong, to be able to recognize when they screw up and try to do something about it, but not good enough to avoid making the bad choices in the first place, right? It's like we're evolved a lot more than any other species on the planet, but not really enough that we just inherently automatically know what's right and do it in an unthinking way. We weigh lots of different things, right? And so, given that we're not going to evolve into a different way for, a long, long time, if ever, and yet technology is evolving at such a fast pace, where the human brain is from an evolutionary standpoint and where the world is from a business and technology standpoint are two very different places. And I think it puts us in this place of like, yes, we may not be able to handle all of this responsibility and we may just destroy it by either ultimately using the weapons that we've built to kill each other or not fixing climate change or someone, unleashes a pandemic or AI, right? Or maybe the better angels in nature ways out and the things that we're working on to save us do slightly better than the things that could destroy us. And we hang on, right? And like, to me, that's sort of the big existential question that I'm just struggling with all the time.
To your point, right? This is the great filter, right? We've survived this long and we seem to take that for granted, I think, a lot.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, keep in mind, we survived this long, but like the Industrial Revolution was only a couple of hundred years ago.
Right.
Right. So yeah, humanity may be 250,000 years old, but we're only talking about like 0.001% of the time that humans have existed, where all of this change has all of a sudden happened. And it's both incredible. You wouldn't want to go back and live in 1500 or whatever it is, but also terrifying because in 1500, the existential risk that I just spoke about a second ago didn't exist, right? So it cuts both ways.
Gotcha. What do you wish more people would ask you about?
It's a really good question. I mean, mobile voting is sort of my obsession these days, and that's why, rather than wait for people to ask me about it, I take every opportunity I can to go out there and talk about it publicly.
So as far as I understand with the mobile voting thing, the real thesis here is that like only the real radicals are actually turning out to primaries, yep. And the way of bringing that closer to the center is by just making it more accessible, yep, for people.
That's simple.
So I guess the big question that I think anybody would have naturally is how do you ensure that this is secure in the first place?
Totally right? Fair. So that's why I just spent so much money trying to build this thing. Look, and that's a fair question, right? And unless you have a genuine reason to not want to see more people vote, there's no reason you should oppose mobile voting if it's at least as safe as paper ballots and voting machines. Sure. I don't think it should be held to a higher standard than those systems, but we should at least be required to be as safe. And so look, that's why we are in the middle of building this technology that is, completely encrypted, the only voting system in the world that will be that way from the first time you touch the data till the last time. Get a printout of every single copy. You can verify your vote and track its progress all the way through the system itself as it moves along. It is, significant evolutionary steps ahead of what exists today. But look, I could save a little money in a little time if I took what we have right now and I put it out there, but I got some results back from, one we hired for testing the other day. And I was like, what, we're not there yet. We're close, but we're not there yet. Mm-hmm. And so now my September launch is probably more like a January launch, and that's okay. And so we've got to prove that value proposition. The problem is going to be this, right? If you are currently in power, you have no incentive to make it easier to lose power, right? So if I said to Chuck Schumer, and I was Chuck's communications director, and I know him reasonably well, and if it's Chuck, hey, Chuck, here are 25 issues you purport to care about, they'd all be more likely to happen if we had mobile voting. His only reaction would be, I'm not making it easier for AOC to primary me, and that's it, and he wouldn't do it. And so the problem's going to be people in power, Democrats, Republicans, lobbyists, unions, trade groups, a lot of them are going to instinctively oppose this, not because they don't think that it would be good for society, but because, again, policy outputs are shaped by political inputs, and it's not the right incentives for them, which means, I need an Arab Spring from Gen Z, right, and Gen Alpha, and maybe millennials to a certain extent. Once we can prove the safety of this thing, I need people to stand up and say, Bullshit. You're telling me it's not secure, but you're telling me that because you don't have any other good reason to say no to it, right? Even when they passed laws in Georgia or Texas limiting voting rights, no one said openly, I don't want black people to vote. They talked about integrity, security, all these nonsense buzzwords, but that's what they were doing, right?
Yeah.
And so they're never going to say that here either. And that's why it was so important for us to put in the kind of resources to prove out the safety of the system, because once we prove it out, you don't have a good argument against it, right? Then it's just purely protectionism and self-preservation. And so the next step, once we put the tech out, is to build a movement among Gen Z and Gen Alpha to demand this. And they say, look, we vote, we do our love life on our phones, we do our healthcare on our phones, we do our banking on our phones. There's no reason we can't plug our phones.
Out of curiosity, because I happen to be a nerd about this specific niche topic, what's the mechanism for proof of personhood with this? How do you ensure that whoever's voting is both alive and a unique person?
So a few things. So one is, to a certain extent, so the election law in the U.S. is decentralized. So every jurisdiction has their own rules. We're not trying to get in there and rewrite every rule, because that's way beyond our pay grade. So one is, it's whatever that jurisdiction. So for military, for example, the first thing they do is you take a video scan of your face and it's matched up against your ID for facial recognition. Then you do your fingerprint. And then at that point, you verify that you're you. We're also adding multi-factor authentication so that, because we feel like even though we'll comply with whatever the laws are, however stringent or lax they might be, there's no reason we can't sort of make sure that, you're using your device, right? And so it's a combination of whatever rules the jurisdiction has combined with things that we can do just to make sure that it's at least actually your device and everything else. Look, the military thing works really well. I'd be perfectly happy at that system. I know that other people would say that that's way too difficult and stringent. Kind of like school meals, right? Like there's a good fight to be had about the nutritional value of school meals. My view is I want kids to have food. And yes, the other thing is an important question, and people should have that fight, but let's first just get food on their plates to begin with. And I think the same kind of thing is true with voting.
So, across everything we've talked about today, you've got the VC fund, political consulting firm, you're incubating startups, you were our SPAC chairman, mobile voting, Hunger.
I fucked that up.
P&T, Fast Company column, author of 2 books now, the podcast, you're an adjunct professor. How do you do so much stuff at once?
Because I don't really do that much, if it makes sense. What do I do on a day-to-day basis? I run the venture fund, right, with Jordan. So I'm meeting with portfolio companies. I'm getting pitched by new founders. We're thinking about investments. So sure, that's a big chunk of my time for sure. Voting, hunger, and abortion, when I need to be the face of something, I am. I shouldn't have to make the money to pay for it, but that comes from the consulting firm and the fund, not from the activities of that. And really good people work for me who do it. I certainly spend a decent amount of time on content creation. Record 2 podcasts a week, and we usually write about 2 columns a month. And I teach, every week, but just 1 semester a year. And I've got books and everything else come out. So, but I would argue that all of that content creation is really useful for the businesses because it does 2 things. One is it just generates a tremendous amount of free publicity for us, right? And so, like when we launched Tusk Ventures, we had to actually build the market for itself, right? There was no niche market around regulation and technology, and so we had to create it. And the thing that I think to me is the best sign that we've done it well is when I talk to a founder about their company, no one ever questions, will you be able to achieve the regulatory thing? It's taken as a given, which by the way isn't always true, right? Which is why sometimes we don't take something on because we feel like we can't achieve whatever it is, or sometimes we think we can and we fail. But overall, I think that the point of all the content creation, because it's not like I'm talking about, TV shows and going bowling. I'm talking about politics and technology and regulation and economics and venture. It all feeds into it. So like the other day I was on Squawk Box for 5 minutes talking about the debt ceiling and then mobile voting. But, what a founder hears is the person that knows how to solve my digital health regulatory problem, the person that knows how to solve my crypto regulatory problem or whatever it is. And so I would say I spend, a decent amount of time on content creation, but it sort of yields a lot of benefits. I've also realized just as I've gotten older that if over the course of a week, I can do stuff that makes money, stuff that helps the world, and stuff that engages me intellectually. And sometimes there's overlap, sometimes there isn't. That's what makes me happy.
I think a lot of this as well that, often goes discounted for anybody in your position is great teams of people around you really helping a lot of this stuff happen. I'm curious on both sides of that. A, what do you look for in people? And B, what have been the biggest lessons for you as a leader?
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know if this is a controversial view or not, but I think that academic pedigree and IQ are wildly overrated. I just think that if you look at what it takes for most people to succeed in the real world, you got to be smart enough, right? But take my businesses, right? We're not curing cancer, right? The most complicated thing we're doing is probably, the mobile voting tech. And like, those are outside firms doing it, not my employees. And like, so what really creates success? I would say it's hustle, it's street smarts, it's work ethic, it's the ability to sell, communication skills, character, integrity, risk tolerance, relentlessness. Those are the things that really make for a successful person in the marketplace, far more than where you went to school or what you get on some test or anything else like that. And so I think we have de-emphasized hiring from elite institutions. Sometimes we do, but you don't get any extra points for coming from Princeton or Harvard, or there might even be a little more skepticism on our part. So one is we really look for those qualities, right? And that's true in all of the different businesses that we have across the board. And I think by doing that, we've been able to find people who have real inner talent that goes just beyond a resume and a piece of paper. Like we had an employee once, she was lovely. She went to Princeton. She worked at Goldman. She wasn't cut out for venture capital, right? At least in our assessment. And so, I just think the correlation between sort of what are considered to be the normal credentials and what actually leads to success are very different. And look, it's interesting because personally, I've got a kid in 11th grade and we are in the middle of taking the SATs on Saturday. And, we're looking at colleges and all that stuff. And I spent a lot of time saying to her, don't worry about it. Like, I don't think it matters where you go to college. Just go somewhere that you think you'll have a good experience and meet people that you like and learn things. And whether it's number 20 or 180 doesn't make a fucking difference. It's fine. And I think I've been able to persuade her of that. Although, of course, she goes to like a Manhattan private school and all of the pressure is trending in the other direction. And so I'm seeing this. And there was a moment where I asked myself, okay, so you talk a big game about this. You implemented a hiring policy for your businesses, but now you're your own kid, right? Are you truly devoted enough to this concept to tell your own kid, I don't care if you go to an Ivy League school. I don't care where you go to college. And so far, so good. I've been consistent on that. And look, a couple of months ago, the Princeton Student Entrepreneurs Club showed up in my office, and they were supposed to be there. And they were meeting with different venture capitalists, and they wanted to ask questions. Fine. And I say yes to that stuff pretty much across the board, whoever it is. But I find something about Princeton a little annoying. I apologize if you went there. But
I did. UFC.
There you go. Well, that I would argue the best school in the world. Right. I knew that. I just wondered if you went for grad school or undergrad.
Undergrad. I'm 22, man.
Oh, so you didn't go to grad school yet? Yeah. I went there for law school, so I think you know. And I do love UFC. I think it's sort of a unique place. But what makes it unique is the academic rigor, not the sort of pomp and circumstance, right? And that's what I loved about it. But so these kids come in to see me, and I'm in a shitty mood because I'm in a fight with the governor's office in New York over funding for school meals. I felt like I'd been lied to, and I was really angry, and I felt like my own team wasn't supporting me enough. I just went into the meeting in a bad mood. I had 45 minutes. And they said, we're first going to go around and tell you about ourselves. I said, no, stop. I said, listen, it's going to take up half of our time. You traveled all the way here to talk to me. I'm not going to remember a word of it. Just ask me your questions. So now they're a little off put because how dare you tell a Princeton student that you don't want to hear their life story, right? So they ask me questions. And they're like just everything's annoying me. And I don't think it's really their fault. I'm just in a shitty mood. And one woman asked, what career advice do you give your kids? And I said, funny timing, because I have a kid in 11th grade, and then I proceeded to tell everything I just told you. And it was like the worst thing they'd ever heard in their lives, because these kids spent every waking moment, working to get into Princeton. Their entire self-image, entire identity is around they go to Princeton. It's so special, and life will be so wonderful because they go to Princeton. And then here's someone doing a job that they, are interested in, completely puncturing the bubble. And one woman said to me, well, look, you went to Penn for undergrad, in Chicago for law school, like you say this, but you went to these kinds of schools. And so I went back and did an inventory. I put it up on Medium, wrote it up, of every job I've ever had from the day I graduated college, or even before that, till today, every business I've ever owned, everything else, and tried to analyze, okay, how much of an impact did where I went to college or I went to law school have? And the answer for me was extremely little. So I just don't think it matters.
On the topic of lessons,
yeah,
what skill or what thing do you wish you'd learned earlier?
Oh man, I mean, there's so many. First of all, I'm an idiot savant, right? And I am very lucky that I was born in this time, in this place in history, where the skills that I happen to have are highly valued by the marketplace, and I have the ability to do things with them. Because I don't know how to change a tire. I don't know where the carburetor is. I don't actually understand how the TV really works. I can't ride a bike. I can barely swim. Like, there's so many basic things that human beings, functioning beings, can do that I don't do. And I just happen to live in a time in history where you don't have to know how to do those things. You can kind of get away with it, right? But I would say the number one thing is just, and it's funny because I don't know if you watch Succession, but wrapped up on Sunday night. And the point of the show is that, endless amounts of money, status, and power does not equate to happiness, right? I'm a first-generation American, grew up in a home of Holocaust survivors, and there was just this tremendous amount of belief and pressure of like, we went through hell to get to this point. You now have to go succeed, which was embodied by, go to an Ivy League school, go to law school. And the thing that I did that my parents were devastated by was, when I finished law school, instead of taking one of these jobs at a top law firm, I turned it all down and went to the Parks Department in New York instead. And they've finally gotten over it, but it took a couple of decades. But I think I always believe that I would be happy if I maximized everything: status, money, power, accomplishments, all of that stuff. And I'm coming around to the point of view that being content is what actually matters. Feeling good about who you are and what you have, because you're never going to be the person with the most of anything, right? Even Mike Bloomberg, who's the most successful person I know, he's not the richest guy in the world. He's not the most powerful political leader in the world. He's not the most generous philanthropist in the world. He's all of those things, but he's not the, right? And you're never going to be the, right? And even when you are, I don't know if I'd want to be Elon Musk. He seems kind of like a mess, right? And so I think learning to say, this is what makes me happy. I've spent a lot of time kind of studying happiness science, and there really are two pillars to it that I think that you see consistently throughout the literature. The first is relationships, right? People who have a handful of supportive, mutually loving relationships. And it can be romantic, it could be family, it could be friends, it could be, members of a community. There's no specific thing that it has to be, but people that you genuinely care about and that genuinely care about you. And then fulfillment, that whatever you're doing, it could be your work, it could be volunteer activities, it could be your hobby, whatever it is, something is giving you a sense of meaning and purpose. If you have those two things, your likelihood of being happy is significantly greater. If you lack those two things, as Succession showed us, your likelihood of being happy is significantly lower. And so I think having both of those things in your life, and then in being able to say, I am content because I'm getting a sense of purpose and meaning and fulfillment out of these relationships, these activities, whatever it is, and that's the standard by which you judge yourself, that has enabled me to be a lot happier. And look, it took for me a year of a lot of radical self-exploration. So the same year that I did ketamine therapy, I was something called dialectical behavioral therapy and went through a 12-week course on that. And then for the first time, I sort of took meditation seriously, and I've been taking a class once a week for the last 7-8 months now. And all of that combined, I think, and I guess turning 50, which I do in October, was kind of like covering over me, really enabled me to kind of re-examine my approach to life and make a lot of changes as a result of it. But so I wish I understood that earlier. And I would say, my kids, I used to say, well, I worry that they're not going to be as successful as I am because they're being raised with so much wealth and so much entitlement. They're so soft, and don't have to struggle for anything and whatever else. And, oh no, isn't that bad? Isn't it better to be a first generation American when you're scratching and clawing for everything? And that was my view until fairly recently. I was worried about my kids. And I realized, you know what? I just want them to be content, right? If there are people in their lives that love and they love them, and there are things that they can do that give them fulfillment and meaning, it's That's all that fucking matters. And it doesn't really matter what college they go to or what grad school they go to or how much money they make or the name of the company they work for or anything else. And so as a parent, I've evolved also in this direction. And it's maybe not the right direction to push your kids towards the most conventional success. And so maybe I'll one day look back and say I was really wrong. I'll relist this podcast and realize how wrong I was about everything. But that's, at least where my head's been.
I've got one more for you because we're coming up on time.
Sure.
I ask the same thing at the end of every interview. Inside or outside the scope of everything we talked about today,
Yeah.
What should more people be paying attention to?
That's a great question. I mean, I guess I'm going to conclude it with the way we started because I would be silly not to, which is we live in a world that often feels irrational, and that becomes scary and upsetting. And the bad news is not everyone is incentivized by the same things or by the common good. The good news is 99.9% of people act in a highly rational way where their outputs are reflective of the inputs they have. And if you want someone to be able to do what it is you want them to do, whether it's a corporation to change their behavior, a politician to change their behavior, a family member, whatever it is, you have to understand the inputs that matter to them. And then when you do, you say, okay, I can impact these inputs in a positive or a negative way. And look, we use negative a lot in my business, so it's not all sunshine and roses. But if you can understand why people do what they do, what motivates them to do what they do. In fact, the novel that I wrote, it's the last question, I'll just plug it. It's called Obvious in Hindsight. It's about a campaign to legalize flying cars in New York, LA, and Austin. On one side is the startup that's doing it and their ruthless political consultants. And the other side is Uber and Taxi united against it, the Audubon Society, the transit workers, the socialists, and the Russian mob. And it's a farce, but it's the point of the book, though, is in an entertaining way to show readers, here's why people in tech make the decisions they make. Here's why people in office make the decisions they make. Because if you can understand why, then you can do something about it. And so I think rather than just saying it ought to be this way or everything's terrible and just putting your head in the sand, recognize that human nature is what it is, accept it for what it is, figure out with each person you need to deal with what it is that motivates and incentivizes them, and do that.
Ash, I think we got it. I think we're good.
All right, guys, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.